All right, good Friday morning from the National Weather Service here in Raleigh. We are coming to you around 11:30 on Friday for the updated Florence briefing. Hurricane Florence has made landfall, and we'll be talking about some of the hazards that we're expecting and focusing on some of the changes that have occurred in the last 12 hours or so since we were last with you. If you can, and if you start seeing flickering, I know we had some issues yesterday, please let us know by inserting a quick question. We have that up on the other screen. But I wanted to show you guys, and I'm actually joined today by Greg Hansen, who's the current warning coordination meteorologist. That's Nick Petro's position here at the National Weather Service Raleigh, but Greg is actually out in Boulder, Colorado, and he's the former hydrologist at Burlington, Vermont. So he has a long history working, even some tropical events make their way up there in Vermont. So we're very thankful to have him and a couple other staff members supplementing our crew here in the National Weather Service in Raleigh. So Greg, thanks for being with us, and I will be hearing a lot from you here in the next 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here and glad to come and help out.
Yeah. Well, so let's dive right in. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to enter them into the questions bar. We'll get to as many of them as you can. And as always, if we don't answer them live with you right now, feel free to submit them to our office, either on social media or certainly contact us at any point. We're more than willing to help you guys out. So let's take a look at Hurricane Florence right now, who has made landfall. It made landfall a little bit earlier this morning. Currently spinning just south of Wilmington, right there at the Cape Fear area of the southeast North Carolina. And as you can tell, what is left at the eye, and the eye wall is kind of suffering a little bit now that it's made some landfall, which isn't unusual for a storm like this. But now that it has made landfall, it really hasn't moved very far in the last really 3 or 4 hours this morning.
Right, and that's the thing we'll be looking at for the next coming days for the flood threat, is this very slow movement of the storm.
Yeah, and we're seeing some of the heavier bands moving out of New Bern, moving west of Greenville into portions of central North Carolina. And unfortunately, this is going to be the tail probably for the foreseeable future here in central North Carolina, and setting up the stage for what is now becoming, and something that we knew a little bit ahead of time, but now it's becoming a serious flooding concern for us, even here in central North Carolina, well inland from where the center is.
Right, yeah, once the winds die down and the focus falls away from the landfall of the hurricane and the storm surge and all that goes along with it, in the end it becomes just a big flood event.
All right, let's dive into the slides here. So this is briefing number 17. If you're joining us anytime after Friday, probably around the 5 p.m. time frame, visit our website at www.weather.gov/Raleigh for the latest weather information. This is still a very dynamic situation. Things are going to change rapidly. We have a lot of watches, warnings, advisories coming out, and we're expecting a lot more, just not only today, but probably for the next 3, 4, 5 days, if not longer, when it comes to some of the river flooding threats. So please don't hesitate to seek the most recent information at weather.gov/Raleigh. So some changes since the last briefing. Florence did make landfall early this morning, right around 7:15 a.m. This event is transitioning to a flooding threat, and it could be potentially catastrophic, not only with the flash flooding concern over the next 24 to 48 hours, but also eventually into a river flood concern, where we're expecting not only minor flooding, but major, up to major, moderate to major flooding across area rivers. And a lot of those rivers, as of this morning, already have flood warnings issued.
Right, yeah, we started on the midnight shift and issued a few river flood warnings based on the forecast rainfall. And then this morning, our confidence grew for a few more places, and we increased those river flood warnings. So it's going to be quite a while till we start to see those things go above flood stage, in some cases a couple of days even. But we wanted to get those flood warnings out very quickly. But yeah, so there's going to be the transition from the flash flooding in the immediate term, where that's the rapidly moving water, the kind that'll scour out road beds and wash cars off. And it'll transition into the inundation flooding, the river flooding, where big areas are underwater, and bring its own source of threats.
Yeah, so let's kind of look at those threats. We're still expecting some extreme flash flooding and river flooding threats as we progress into the main portion of the rainfall, which will likely fall in the next 48 to 72 hours. But we're going to probably see rain hanging around for several days, even into early next week. From this system as it kind of slowly meanders south and west across South Carolina. And the track, we'll look at the track a little bit later, there really hasn't been much change, at least in the last 12 hours or so, with the expected track of this system, at least in the first 3 to 5 days. Wind is still a significant threat, especially today. That will be slowly becoming less and less of a threat as early as tonight, but we're still expecting those 20 to 35 mile an hour winds with gusts up to 50 and or higher, especially in the southeastern coastal plain, a little bit closer to the center of the storm. Tornadoes are also a threat. We've been monitoring these tropical showers very closely, and a lot of them actually start to have that low-level rotation that you tend to see in these storms, Greg. And what type of tornadoes do we typically see with a tropical setup like this?
Yeah, they tend to be it's still significant if it's a tornado, but it's the weaker end of things, very short-lived. They spin up and do their business and go away very quickly. But while they're weaker, they're still can be killers. So when you get a tornado warning, take that seriously. Head indoors, the lowest level of your home. Get into a basement if you can. Put as many walls between you and the outside as you can, and to save yourself from the tornado threat. The good thing, if there is one, is these tend to not be the really strong ones that rip an entire house off its foundations. If you get inside a sturdy building, in an interior room, protect yourself from falling debris, you should be okay.
Yeah, and with all three of the hazards we mentioned, the wind threat, which is an immediate threat, the flooding and river flooding threat, and also the tornado threat, power outages are really a concern. We've already seen numbers as high as 500,000 or approaching that 500,000 mark of power outages across North Carolina, and we're likely to see that number double, if not triple, as this storm continues its path to the west.
Yeah, as we were talking, as the soil becomes wetter, it's harder for the trees to stay upright, and even a small wind. So we'll expect to see those power outages go up. The good news, I shared my hotel, not my room, but my hotel with some power companies in the area to help get that power restored. So the state's really on it to get that back and going.
Yeah, we're in a very unique situation where we knew this event was coming, so we were able to prepare for several days, and it seems like the state did a really good job communicating with us to find out the threats, and it seems like a lot of those companies, utility companies, state companies, are prepared to get us back on the grid. Unfortunately, with the slow nature of the storm, it may be unsafe to do so for several days, so remain patient. The storm will finally lift off sometime early next week, and from then it'll be a gamut to try to get everybody back into power. So here's a quick look at the main points. I've been on the page a little bit and we talked a lot about them, so I won't linger too long. Just keep in mind we're going to transition from a primary wind threat today and tonight to more of that flooding threat, which is already ongoing. We have flash flood warning alerts already out, to a river flood type threat, which could persist several weeks after the event with some of the numbers we're seeing when it comes to rainfall. So we'll touch a little bit on that as we progress forward here. Just want to show you the latest information. Hurricane Florence did come on shore this morning around 7:15 a.m. As a Category 1 storm, a pretty powerful Category 1 storm with 90-mile-an-hour winds and a pressure right around 958 millibars near Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina, and it really hasn't moved too much. It may have drifted just southwest a little bit from that position, but the last 2 or 3 hours we've seen very little movement. We have seen some weakening with the maximum winds. It's now sitting at 80 miles an hour over the Cape Fear area near or just south of Wilmington, and its movement is down to 3 miles an hour. That is a snail's pace, and as you can see from these forecast dots and how close they are together for the next 24 to 48 hours, it's not going to move very far, and we're still in that region of most favored rainfall with this type of system. So our threats still linger, and we have a lot to look ahead to.
Right, with the storm location where it is, the center to our south, that means we'll be in this onshore flow area for quite a while. So you've just got all this moisture coming in off the still very warm Atlantic, heading uphill. That lift as it moves up the terrain helps produce the rainfall rate. So very heavy rainfall for quite a bit of time.
Yeah, and it's certainly not to overlook, but as an inland office, we don't typically have to deal with this, but the eastern half of North Carolina is also seeing a major surge type event going on now, and that's likely to linger for the next 24 36 hours too. So for those that have houses or a family to the east, they are still under the gun and will remain under the gun for probably another tidal cycle or two before we can finally get some of that onshore winds abated at least a little bit. So let's go into some specific threats. Our wind threat still remains primarily to the south and east across portions of Sampson County there. Has the best chance of seeing some hurricane force winds. The hurricane warning continues in this area for most of tonight, at least till those winds start dying down into your day Saturday. But we're still expecting some high winds to persist even for the next 24, 48, even 72 hours. We'll see some unusual 20 to 30 mile-an-hour winds with some higher gusts, especially if a band comes through that's going to incorporate some heavy rainfall. Here's a look at your peak wind gusts or peak winds and wind gusts tonight. You'll see the highest winds, which could reach sustained up to almost 50 in the far southern tip of Sampson County. I'm looking right here, almost 50 sustained, gusting at times up to 81. So we're certainly seeing some hurricane force wind potential, especially in the southern and central portions of Sampson County there, while the rest could see some pretty good gusts. And honestly, with the amount of rain we've had leading up to this event, but also some of the rain that has fallen from the triangle eastward already, we already have some saturated soils, and this wind is plenty to get us some tree damage. We've seen some of that already going forward.
Right, yeah, and that's where the danger for the power outages come as well. Even a moderate-sized tree limb coming down can take a power line down too.
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to see those power outage numbers climb, sadly, from here on out. Let's transition a little bit in the rain because that is the key story now. We're expecting some significant rainfall amounts over the next 7 days. In many places, maybe measuring it not in inches but in feet. A lot of areas are 20-plus inches, especially across the coastal plain, the southern coastal plain of North Carolina.
Right. We've seen some observations come in already this morning along that coastal plain of 6 and 8 inches of rain that just would have been in the past 12 hours or so. So if you add up those amounts to over 24, 36 hours, that's where you can see that 2 feet of rain coming out. One point we want to make as we start talking about rivers, the rainfall that flows into a river is what falls over an entire river basin. So it's a funnel effect where whatever falls in that funnel gets channeled into the river. So if you see this 20-plus inches of rain, sometimes that's kind of alarming when you're thinking about what the river stage might get. But also keep in mind that these rainfall amounts taper off as you go west and north. So the entire basin amount of rainfall isn't that 2 feet of rain. So that's a little bit of good news. Nevertheless, we're still going to have some major flooding, catastrophic flooding. A few places may even hit some new record flood crests.
That's right. Yeah, we're looking at anywhere from 6 to 8 inches, maybe topping a localized 10-inch amount across portions of the Triad, where a lot of the headwaters regions are, at least when it comes to our area. So even with that and the fact that everybody's going to see similar rainfall amounts in that area, what typically see in the tropical system, that's plenty to cause some significant concern for flooding. So we'll be closely monitoring it and likely enhancing some of our wording and trying to pinpoint specific threats along rivers. And we'll actually get a little bit more into some of those threats here. So we're expecting that extreme potential for flooding, mainly across the southern Piedmont, eastern Sandhills, and the southeastern coastal plain, but a potential for major flooding rains persists over a large portion of the area. This includes the Triad, but also the western Sandhills and even the foothills of the Appalachians. So there really isn't many places in our area that is going to come off scotch-free from all this rainfall that we're seeing. So certainly do not take this threat lightly. We are expecting a lot in the way of flash flooding here in the next 24 to 48 hours, with transitioning quickly to some river flooding issues, including a lot of flood warnings, both flash and river floods that have already been issued from our office and many of our neighboring offices too. We don't want to discount the tornado threat. Typically, tropical tornadoes, like we talked about, are short-lived. They tend to be on the weaker side. We're talking EF1, EF2 tops when they finally get out to damage survey them. But there's still a risk, especially if one approaches your home. So know where to go during a tropical or during any type of tornado, and that's typically your interior room at the lowest possible point in your house. But you also want to do it safely. And a lot of times we talk about the issue of, hey, we've got a flooding threat, and we have a tornado threat. So should people be going in their basements? If you're under a tornado warning, yes. However, in a flood, you don't necessarily, if your house is getting impacted by flooding, you don't necessarily want to go into those basement areas that are prone to some of that flooding. So certainly be ready to react and have a plan in place before any of these warnings are issued in your area. Taking a look at the tornado threat, it's a little bit bigger than the SPC outlook you saw on the previous slide, and that's because it's going to last into tomorrow. And tomorrow we're going to see a bit of a southern shift in our tornado threat and a bit to the west. So we'll be monitoring the situation, and there are a lot of these short-lived couplets, and that's kind of a convergence of wind. And that's the typical thing we look at on radar to be able to issue those warnings. We have seen some of those today. They haven't been quite strong enough to issue tornado warnings, at least recently, but that doesn't mean once we get a little bit of daytime heating in between some of these bands of showers, we couldn't see this threat become maximized by this afternoon and evening.
Right, and it's a very quick reaction time between when we see it on the radar, when we can get the warning out, and then when the tornado might be on the ground. So pay attention to those warnings and be ready to move quickly.
That's right. So we're taking a look, and we talked a lot about, and Greg, this is your expertise, so I want to give a lot of the floor to you here. But river flooding is certainly going to transition into a major concern here in the especially after we get this first couple bands of flooding rains, but also as we progress through the event and we start to get some of those 20-plus inch amounts. What are we most concerned about when it comes to rivers?
Yeah, so the southern southeast rivers, the coastal plains, and the Sandhills region, those rivers are going to be the main ones that get the bulk of that 20-inch to 15 to 20-inch rainfall. We do have some that are going to be coming up into the major category. One of the ones we're really concerned with is the Cape Fear River at Fayetteville. We really need to watch that one pretty closely. We could have a flood of record. We have a flood of record forecast for the Little River near Manchester. We'll see how that plays out. We're constantly updating these forecasts and these warnings. So even these dots of the purple and red you see, we probably should see a little bit more purple here as we're continually updating our rainfall forecast and putting that into our forecast for the rivers. That's bumping things up a little bit. Once we get some rain in the rain buckets, once we start measuring this stuff on the ground, we'll be able to fine-tune these river forecasts to what's actually the rain that's actually fallen. So don't look at just today's forecast and stick with that one for the rest of the week. Constantly check back at our website to get the latest forecast information.
Yeah, and one of the things we're talking about is some of the trends in the forecast that we're seeing. QPF is slowly inching up, which also causes our rivers or river flooding threats to inch up. And a lot of these dots that you see are expected to go into minor or moderate may actually end up in major. And we're seeing that trend from what we were talking about earlier actually starting to continue on.
Right. Just today we included a little more rainfall, and that made our crest forecasts go up into those higher categories. So stay tuned and keep abreast of the changes.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about the Cape Fear at Fayetteville, or the Cape Fear River Basin in general, and taking a look at a expected or a forecast look at the radar. This is during on Saturday morning. We're going to see that band of heaviest rain, a lot of which sorry about that. As band of heaviest rain actually sitting over the southern half of North Carolina. And notice this storm really hasn't ventured very far, and we're talking 24 hours after landfall, and that is not a very far amount of time according to this forecast. So that just shows you how long some of these heavy bands that are capable of producing 2 to 3 inch per hour rates are going to sit over some of these areas. And because of that, we're seeing quite the reaction on the area waterways, including the Cape Fear River.
Right. So let me try out the pen tool here.
Yeah.
So looking at this forecast rainfall, you can see this is a forecast for what the radar should look like on Saturday morning, and it's not too different from what we're seeing right now. So this onslaught of precipitation coming in from the coast just stays there for 24 hours or so. So you can see this graph on the left. This is the Cape Fear River at Fayetteville. This is our latest forecast. The crest we have forecast is right near 62 feet, and that will occur on midday Tuesday is when we're forecasting it to crest right now. Again, stay tuned. If there more rain falls earlier in this time period, we could see an earlier crest, or if it continues a little bit later, this part where it's receding may actually kind of flatten out and stay above the major flood stage for a while. So we're expecting it to go above flood stage in this category here midday Sunday, continue to rise, hit that major stage a little bit later. We ran some numbers, and if you follow along on the FEMA flood insurance rates, the 100-year floodplains, that's not. This happens every 100 years. We know Matthew happened 2 years ago. Really is a 1% chance of occurrence in each year. So don't think of it as that 500-year duration. A 100-year flood really means there's a 1% chance of this happening in a year. A 500-year flood means there's a 0.2% chance. It's more rare in any given year. But this 62-foot crest we're forecasting right now is right at that 100-year, that 1% chance of occurrence stage. So we're looking at the 100-year flood that we're forecasting right now for the Cape Fear at Fayetteville.
Yeah, and that's just one example of many in our forecast area. We're expecting, like we talked about earlier, a very large swath of impressive rainfall totals all across central North Carolina. And that's going to cause all different types of reactions. Kathleen, one of our other forecasters here, put this great table together showing some of the estimated times that the river will hit flood stage for those that will hit flood stage, the estimated crest of that river once it does hit flood stage, and the time of the crest. And you'll see a lot of variation in it because depending on the basin, depending on how deep the river is, how much headwaters the river has in our area, and a lot of other factors, there can be some significant both time and duration impacts when it comes to how long these will be in flooding and how high they may get.
That's right. And so check the flood warnings. We have impact statements in there based on either what levels we've surveyed in. We go to the river gauge site and see if the water gets to a certain height, what's going to flood, or based on past experience. So check those flood warnings. We'll list the impacts at these stages, try to give people a sense of what's going to flood. And also on our website with all the river stages, we also have that listed out for every stage we have that information on. So not only with the flood warning, but just in general, you can go and review what's going to flood at certain stages.
All right. Let's see here. All right, so you guys have seen this graphic. There hasn't been too much changes from the last time we showed you this graphic. We're still expecting the primary extreme impacts to be south along that southern tier counties in our forecast area. And it's going to gradually get less and less impactful all the way north. But honestly, I don't feel comfortable telling any emergency manager in our forecast area to stand down because even in that far northern tier of counties, we still are expecting anywhere from 4 to 6 inches of rain. And if that rain were to come all at once or in this scenario over maybe a 12-hour period, that is going to have some significant impacts in the way of flash flooding, or it potentially could have that. So certainly remain weather aware as this system's ongoing. It's going to be several days before we can finally get it out of our area, and there's going to be some very large impacts across the state from it.
Right, yeah. I mean, even though we're drawing the purple area down to the south, 5 to 10 inches of rain is still a lot. It's still going to cause some problems. We'll see even in the northern part of the state, some flooding that can cause a hazard if someone doesn't do the right thing and not drive into it.
That's right. And we'll talk about some of these hazards. This is some pictures we've showed you the last couple of conference calls, but these are pictures from Hurricane Matthew. And Matthew is still fresh in our minds, not too displaced from it. But unfortunately, these are very similar features, or some very similar pictures that we've been seeing from even the eastern part of the states already this morning. But we're likely to see this in our part of the state not too long from now as the bands of heaviest rain approach later on today, tonight, and continue most of the day tomorrow and even the first part of Sunday. So these are certainly not a situation you want to take lightly, and we do want to ask for your help to disseminate all of this threat, because we're going to hear over the next 12 hours, we're going to hear over the next 24 hours, even from us here at the National Weather Service, that Florence is weakening. Florence is no longer a hurricane. Florence is no longer a tropical storm. Those words will be muttered quite often over the next 24 to 48 hours, but the threats are not going to diminish like that, especially when it comes to flooding. Flooding from even a tropical depression can be life-threatening and catastrophic. And for what we're looking at is with inland flooding being the primary threat, and flash flooding being a primary soon threat if it's actually ongoing as we speak. this is going to be a hitting point. And I do want to remind everybody, during Hurricane Matthew, freshwater flooding was responsible for 83% of the fatalities, and the majority of those fatalities were were due to drowning, according to the coroner. And 76 occurred because while people were in vehicles. A lot of times they were trying to go around already closed roadways, thinking their vehicle can go through it, but all of a sudden, roadways erode from the ground up. The last thing to go away is the pavement. So you cannot guarantee the fact that pavement is still there.
Right. Yeah. A culvert can get washed out underneath there, and then there's just a thin veneer of asphalt, and that's not going to support a car. So,
That's right.
if you're going to do anything on social media, any kind of outreach, please help us hit this "do not drive into flooded roads" topic, because that's really, I think, where we can save lives, is helping people make the correct decision to not drive into water. We have a lot of safety material. If you're looking for some graphics, you can see on this slide here, weather.gov/flood. There's also floodsafety.noaa.gov. Both those sites will have a lot of graphics and a lot of help for you if you want some material to post for flood safety.
Yeah, and one last fact to give you before we move on is all deaths attributed to Matthew actually occurred on the inland counties. So no county touching the water actually reported any deaths from Matthew. So inland flooding is certainly a hazard. It's certainly not one to take for granted. And unfortunately, it's going to be one that we're going to talk about for several days.
Yeah, and that speaks to our success communicating the hurricane risk, the storm surge, the wind threat as they make landfall. But we still have work to do to communicate this flood threat inland.
That's very true. So just a quick review for those who may have logged on late. Hurricane Florence has made landfall and continues to slowly drift across the far southeastern portions of North Carolina. And it's not really expected to pick up speed anytime soon. We're going to see it hanging around, being within striking distance, was one way to put it, for several days, and causing a significant amount of rainfall to occur across our southern tier of counties especially, but really across much of the area. And the confidence that this is going to happen is very high, obviously because the event is ongoing. And our primary threat, just to reiterate, is catastrophic flash flooding and eventually river flooding that is expected to persist through the weekend and last likely into early next week. So this isn't a short duration event. This is something that we'll be talking about for several days to come.
It's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
That is very true. So as we're nearing the end of our presentation, please, if you have any questions, certainly let us know. We'll try to answer as many as we can now. And if you don't get through, if we're unable to answer your question now, feel free to contact us at any time. We're here 24/7, 365, always willing to help out. So we'll give it a second and see if anything comes in as we talk about our 3 points. And John, I will say I apologize for some of the background noise. We tried to seclude ourselves, but by doing so, I think we ended up getting into an echo hall. So they're probably sick of me talking, just as sick as you guys are probably of me talking, and unfortunately we can hear a lot of their conversation too. But we apologize for that. And let's go into the 3 key points. So just to reiterate what we've already talked about, the wind impacts continue from Hurricane Florence today, but the primary flooding threat is just beginning as the eye continues to stall just inland. This initial heavy rainfall that we're seeing now will cause flash flooding, and a lot of that flash flooding is ongoing with active warnings across part of the south and eastern portions of our forecast area. And prolonged moderate to major river flooding is expected to continue into early next week across especially the southern half of North Carolina, but could be across a large portion of our area. If you guys are looking, when it comes to traveling and everyday impacts, travel will likely become much more treacherous as the day goes on, and it'll get worse tonight, most of the day tomorrow, and even continue, especially because of the flooding threats into next week. You're going to have some sort of disruption, whether it's the amount of people on the roads trying to move around, trying to get back east after the storm comes through, or still having impacts like trees down across area roadways, because the more water we get, it doesn't take much wind. Even a 5 to 10 mile an hour gust can down some trees if the soil is basically liquid at that point, Greg. So.
Right, yeah, the just loses its ability to keep those trees upright, and away they go.
All right, so we'll take the first question here. It looks like Michelle. Yeah, let me go ahead and stop our recording.